2016 of the San Francisco Ethics Commission. I will first call the roll. Commissioner Andrews.
Here.
Commissioner Herr.
Here.
Commissioner Keene.
Here.
I don't know whether Commissioner Hand will make it this morning, but we will proceed, seeing that we have 4 of us. And before we proceed, I want to mention, as you may all know, that we have our executive director at our first meeting this morning. So, Leanne, we're delighted to see you. Hope you had a good New Year and are ready to hit the ground running. I should tell you, those of you who know, that she officially assumed the position yesterday, but I can assure you that during the month of December, she met on a number of occasions with Mr. Minardi to discuss various issues, including the drafting of the budget and the implementation regulations that are going to be the subject matter of this morning's meeting. And so that although it's unrealistic to expect her to be able to address both of those issues in any great detail this morning, she certainly has been working hard to bring herself up to speed. And in that regard, I also want to thank interim acting executive director Jesse Minardi, who resigned effective December 16th, but who right up to the very end worked diligently to get materials ready for us and to work with Ms. Pelham to the greatest extent possible. And I think both of them should receive the thanks of this commission. Having said that, I will call the second item on the agenda, although it's not listed, and that is any public comment either on items on the agenda or not on the agenda that they wish to discuss. I would urge that if your comments are directed to a specific item, let's wait till we get to it so that we can deal with it in that manner. All right?
Good morning. I'm Bob Planthold. I'm a former member of this commission and former officer, but also a member now of a group, Friends of Ethics, composed of people associated with the Ethics Commission, former grand jurors, Common Cause, other good government advocates. I'm here today to indicate there's a need for you folks to start looking proactively, preemptively at a court decision from San Jose last spring. It has not been appealed, but it's applicable right now only in San Jose. Yet it's a problem that could arise here in San Francisco, and that is the allowance of elected officials to set up committees to help elect other people. This was a case brought by then San Jose Mayor Larry Reed, and it's important because when I say proactively and preemptively, you can read the statement, which would take longer than my 3 minutes. But what I want to point out is that there's an existing opportunity, and I will cite examples from recent past where other loopholes or failures to clarify allowed for problems to develop. There were 2 recent ballot measures attempting to correct problems. One was Prop F last fall to deal with Airbnb. And here again, I'll point out that Airbnb, in its filings with the Ethics Commission, said in the 6 months, the end of 2014, it only spent $714 in change on lobbying, yet they had massive meetings where they provided pizza or beverages or printed material because they were not doing direct lobbying. So the idea of having this possibility of an elected official setting up a committee to also help elect other people is a way to get influence. It happens frequently in Sacramento. It happens frequently in Congress, where the people who raise the most money then spread it around to help other candidates get elected. And in that sense, they gain influence that may not be reflective of their competence. So the idea is start looking soon at the effect of this decision on existing committees here in San Francisco and consider some aspect of guidance, at least, if not regulation, clarification, addressing the question of whether a candidate-controlled committee. And in the statement, you'll see there's reflective of one existing Ed Lee for San Francisco committee. That is not something that we allege is a problem, but it could be. And it could be a case of any other official doing a similar task. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
Good morning, Commissioners. The Commission is taking comments on matters not on the agenda.
Yes.
Thank you. My name is John Sinclair. I've been a resident of San Francisco since 1986, and I'm also a member of the Friends of Ethics. At the last Ethics Commission meeting, Friends of Ethics promised to provide the Commission with a contact list of organizations that may be interested in matters that come before the Commission. And I'm very, very, very happy to take it off my desk this morning and to have delivered it to the Executive Director, and there is additionally a copy for each commissioners. The list is comprised of approximately 200 to 300 organizations. There's an introduction at the front that explains the methodology. Just to summarize, it would be impossible to create a list that would be definitive at any one moment in time. There are more than 8,000 nonprofits registered or headquartered here in San Francisco. This list was comprised by going through those clubs that are chartered by the major political parties, those organizations which are members of the Council of Community Housing, and those organizations which are part of the Human Services Network, those organizations which issued endorsements in the last elections, and those organizations which are registered as slate card mailers. There's more information in the introduction. I also want to add this one last caveat. All of the information is taken from the internet. It's all publicly available. It may not be entirely accurate, but I think for the most part, by and large, it is. Thank you.
Thank you.
I want to urge this commission to begin to hear sunshine complaints. I think, in the weight of other types of complaints that you hear, maybe it's not seen as a priority or so, but it is a priority. And I would like personally to see sunshine complaints be heard here without having to surpass the many hurdles of the Sunshine Ordinance Task Force, because the composition of the task force has changed. Members have resigned and taken other jobs, and new ones have come along, and it's a very burdensome task for just a member of the public to jump over these hurdles in order to be heard by the Ethics Commission. And I believe that you will begin to see more ethics complaints pass your way, and I would urge you to take them seriously and to hear them. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Oliver Luby, appearing on my own behalf. Thank you for indulging open forum at a special meeting. Just piggybacking really briefly off of what Bob Planthold said about candidate-controlled committees that could potentially be used to spend on other candidates. One way that the Commission could rapidly address that problem to some extent would be to pass an amendment to the existing regulations regarding the campaign contribution ban. There is the term controlled committee is defined by regulation, and currently it excludes general purpose ballot measure committees. So you could amend the regulation very easily and to cover other types of committees, such as that type of committee. And currently they can raise unlimited funds from any source and spend them in a broad manner. So that would be a prudent and very easy way to expand that. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comment?
Good morning, Commissioners. Good morning, Executive Director. Mark Solomon from Friends of Ethics, and basically I'd like to bolster what Mr. Luby just said, that we need to cut off this escape valve between the two kinds of committee where we have controls on contributions and we don't. And basically it's just another outlet for unregulated spending to basically try to control legislatures. And we need to get some regulation changes in place quickly to go ahead and address that. I think you'll find that we're seeing adaptations on the part of people who want to influence government quite rapidly. We need to get the Commission in a position where it's agile enough to respond in real time to protect the interests of San Franciscans to have honest government. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Turn now to what is item number 2 on the agenda for this meeting, which is a discussion of possible action on the Commission budget. Is there anyone here from the mayor's office? It was my understanding that a representative was going to be, there you are.
Good morning, members of the Ethics Commission. My name is Anthony Ababon with the Mayor's Budget Office.
Good morning, Anthony. I know you met with Mr. Minardi and Ms. Pelham and myself and Mr. Andrews and Commissioner Andrews in December, but would you just give a brief discussion as to what the mayor's instructions were and are to the Ethics Commission insofar as the preparation of its budget and what guidelines it's to follow?
Sure. So in mid-December of 2015, our office released the mayor's budget instructions. At a very high level, it calls for departments to meet targets of 1.5% in the first year. That's 2016-17.
That's a reduction of 1.5% from their
of general
budget.
fund support.
Yeah. Go ahead.
And then in 2017-18, another 1.5% for a cumulative reduction target of 3% in that second year. In addition, the instructions also called for various goals for departments to discuss and review in a similar format as this. As running through the list, in addition to meeting targets, the departments are encouraged to develop a strategic plan for the department that goes beyond the 2-year horizon of perhaps a 5-year plan that looks at overall the goals of the department over the 5 years, the strategic programs and initiatives that are under development and under discussion, and then how the budget process can be a tool for achieving those goals. In addition, we ask that departments work collaboratively with different departments in reviewing the strategic plan and programs. Members of the public described the Sunshine Task Force. So there's many other opportunities to collaborate, of course. We also asked departments to review the city's existing talent development programs. We mentioned specifically the 1249 program, senior fellows, and City Hall fellows, different talent development programs that the city has and encourages other departments to implement. We asked departments to review specifically proposals that are intended to modernize government, make government more responsive. And in a way, the Ethics Commission has been pursuing these goals broadly already, but those are the kind of the high-level goals that are described in the mayor's policy instructions. And I can mention the others if you like, or I can forward the instructions in written format.
Now, as I understand it, the date that the initial submission by the commission of a budget is February 22nd?
The budgets are due to the Controller's Office February 22nd in the budget system. And then following that, in the budget system as well as the various forms that accompany the budget submission.
Let me just ask you this question. Our meeting, we have another meeting scheduled for the 25th of January where we will further discuss the budget. But our meeting in February takes place on February 28th. In view of the fact that Ms. Pelham has just come on board and the difficulty of trying to finalize the budget essentially by the Commission's meeting on January 25th, is there any leeway so that we could have until the meeting of the 28th of February to make the submission?
I'm not able to give you a definitive answer at the moment. I am very happy to work with Ms. Pelham over the course of the budget season to help as much as I can.
But how would we go about trying to get relief from the mayor on his February 22nd date so that we could have our final approval of the budget occur at a normal meeting on February 28th rather than having to schedule an interim meeting earlier in February?
As a staff person in the mayor's office, I would encourage departments, including the Ethics Commission, to work as hard as they can to submit on February 22nd.
Well, I'm not sure that's responsive to my question. How would we go about, should we contact the mayor directly and discuss it with him and see whether we can get relief from that date?
You're always free to contact the mayor if you'd like. As the instructions kind of clearly describe, the budgets are due February 22nd for all departments across the city.
Is this a situation where it's easier to get forgiveness than permission?
I believe that would be on a case-by-case basis, depending on the facts and circumstances.
In connection with this budget process, I pulled out a chart that was prepared many years ago by a political cartoonist here in San Francisco called Mr. Frank. And it was prepared for my wife when she was a supervisor. And I want to go through the steps and see whether that's still the process or if there are changes from this, which I think was probably the late 80s. But it started off with the mayor's projections. That's the first step, right?
I'm sure the schedule of milestones is a little different. In general, I think that's right. There's projections that are developed. It may not be necessarily in the same way that it was in the 80s. For instance, we work with the Controller's Office.
But that's the first step. The mayor makes his or her projections and says, in this case, says you've got to cut 1.5% from your 16-17 budget, and you've got to cut 1.5% from the next year's budget, correct?
Yes.
And then the next step is that the department submits their budget.
That's the February 22nd date.
And then it goes to the controller's office.
Also the February 22nd date.
And then goes to the mayor's office for review.
It goes through a technical review by the Controller's Office. That time frame is not fixed. And then following that process, it goes to the mayor's office.
And then there's some interim budget adoption by the mayor.
On July 1st is the beginning of the fiscal year. The budget is under consideration by policymakers during that time. And so there is what's called an interim budget that starts July 1st because that's the...
And that interim budget then goes to the Board of Supervisors for their review?
It does, but it doesn't contemplate any changes that have been proposed by departments that are effective in the succeeding 2 years.
What do you mean it doesn't contemplate any change?
For instance, when departments submit their February 22nd budget, there'll be different proposals that are contained in it. It would not be reflected in the interim budget because that budget would still be under consideration. And so the interim budget functions as just an interim budget that doesn't vastly change what has already been adopted. So it's effective for mostly just the month of July, while the final adopted budget is in process.
But my question is that during the period from the time that the department or the Ethics Commission submits its original budget up to the time that the mayor submits the interim budget on July 1st, is there opportunity to make adjustments by the department to its to its estimated budget?
I'm not aware of instances where that's occurred, but I can check. I believe the interim budget is mostly to have a legally available budget for the city just for the month of July while the final budget is in process. And it wouldn't contain significant policy choices that policymakers are considering because it would be succeeded by the final budget. But again, I can follow up on technically if there's interim budget proposals that can be included.
And then following the Board of Supervisors review, there's an adoption by the board of a budget which may or may not be exactly the same as the mayor's interim budget. Is that correct?
Yes.
And then the budget that's approved by the board goes back to the mayor for his or her final action, correct? And then the final action goes back to the supervisors for their final action.
I believe the board has 2 Board of Supervisor meetings to read the budget, and then it's sent to the mayor's office for signature. I don't believe it goes back to the Board of Supervisors.
In any case, I'm still not clear that how set in concrete are we when we submit a budget, if we did, say, by February 22nd or February 28th, how set in concrete is that budget?
From the perspective of the department and the commission, it would contain the best proposed budget of the department, including the policy or consideration of the policy instructions that are contained in the budget instructions. So it isn't set in stone. It will be considered over the course of throughout the entire process that you outlined. And it will be changed over as new projections arise, different costs estimates become available, and so forth.
All right. To the extent that there's a desire to tweak the original budget that's submitted, that's done by either the executive director speaking directly with your office, or myself as the chair of the commission speaking with the office?
Yes.
All right. For the record, I will, and for amusement, I will submit this Frank guide, the guide to the budget, into the record. Thanks.
I might observe that an original Phil Frank would have some value today.
Well, I've got a number of copies of it.
Okay.
Anyway, it's also an 8-page document that I didn't bring along. This is his summary of the steps through it. Any commissioners that have any questions? Sorry. Go ahead, Commissioner Herr.
So I understand that the mayor wants a 1.5% reduction of the current budget from next year. So the 16-17 budget should be, in the mayor's view, 1.5% less than this year's budget. Is that what I understand? What if we don't do that? I mean, we have a new executive director. We have some additional mandates. We have some additional goals, and even the mayor's policy goals seem to suggest that we might need more than what we had this year, not less. What happens if we don't make any proposed cuts?
The city is legally bound to adopt a balanced budget on at the end of July. We will look at all of the budget submissions across the city and consider various policy goals that the mayor and other policymakers have. So the targets are designed to do a number of things. It points to a kind of a fiscal reality that we have currently. And it also gives departments an opportunity to explore other ways of conducting their business, explore different initiatives or different efficiencies within the department. But we, as a city, have to adopt a balanced budget.
I understand that, but it can come from other departments. And I think in this political and legal climate, I mean, wouldn't you agree that the city needs a more robust ethics commission, not a less robust one? And I would hope that most of our elected officials would agree with that as well.
There's, across the city, there's arguments to be made about more robust staffing or more robust programs. We tend to look at it as a citywide requirement to balance the budget. We will consider the unique circumstances of the Ethics Commission.
Thank you.
I did have a question. The interim, just for my own knowledge, the interim budget that exists in the month of July, is that based on the 14-15 budget, or is it based on what is the proposed, just to be clear, the proposed 16-17 budget with no consideration of whatever may also have been submitted by other city general fund departments?
In general, that's right. If you recall, this time last year, departments were considering adopting a 2-year rolling budget. So the 2016-17 budget, that is our first year, the policymakers has adopted kind of a base budget for that year. And so that can be your shorthand for your interim budget. That makes sense.
And then my follow-up is, because we're talking in hypotheticals here, have you seen a situation where a department did not necessarily follow budget instructions and give good rationale for why they didn't, and how was it received, and and what was the outcome?
I can only speak as an analyst in the budget office. It's our responsibility to review all of the budget submissions, and departments may submit budgets that exactly meet the targets, and departments may submit budgets that, in their thinking, meets targets, but in our thinking does not. We will analyze all of the information and the data that we receive, and it really, as I mentioned before, the targets function as a tool for departments to explore different ideas and different ways to operate government more efficiently, among other policy goals.
And then my final question is, let's say we recognize the need to not submit a budget that has a 1.5 reduction, and submit also a rationale for that. Is there an opportunity? Would the mayor's budget office make the decision to reduce and pick line item by line item where they would reduce, or would you come back as a point of process to the commission or the executive director to say, it looks like you didn't necessarily either understand or follow the instruction, here's one more opportunity for you to do such, you should probably do that? Or do you go into a full kind of across-the-board analysis of looking at all of them, all of the submissions, and then take the considerations and could potentially preliminarily adopt that department's budget that may not have a 1.5 reduction?
Over the course of the events, we don't have to wait until February 22nd to have those conversations. We will work with staff of the Commission and Director Pelham as much as we can to ensure that the budget that is submitted reflects the highest priorities of the Commission and the Department. To the extent that it's we're able to, we will try to suggest ways to meet targets. And we will do that for all departments.
Got it. Thank you.
Mr. Keene?
Andrew, until not too long ago, there was a fairly uniform process in regard to budgeting where when you had Harvey Rose's office and a department wanted to negotiate with the mayor's office, they would negotiate with Mr. Rose or with one of Mr. Rose's associates. And during the course of that negotiation, that give and take, oftentimes the mayor would, the Rose office would say, okay, you've convinced us. And if that were the case, that was pretty much a done deal then. The mayor would go along with that in terms of the recommendation. Does that mechanism exist? And now that we don't have Harvey Rose anymore, does that mechanism exist? Are you that mechanism? I'm not quite sure in the discussion that you had with Chair Rennie as to whether or not if we make a case to you that you will then say, oh yeah, I'll go to the mayor and I will recommend to the mayor that this be done for you. Is that your function, or is that anyone's function at this point in city government?
I do want to clarify that the Board of Supervisors maintains Harvey Rose as the budget analyst for the Board of Supervisors, and I believe he's been in that role for a number of years and continues. That process that you describe occurs in the June and July months, where Harvey Rose does review in a similar fashion all the department submissions and recommends changes from those submissions. And it's fairly iterative. It occurs throughout June and July, and there's scheduled meetings usually at the Budget and Finance Committee where those recommendations are discussed and considered.
No, I understand, but the path used to be, and I've been out of it for a little while, but path used to be, even though Harvey Rose is going to plays the role for the Board of Supervisors, that in order to have the negotiations and for a department to maneuver for whatever it was that they had to get, they would early on get with Rose's office, and if there was an agreement from Rose that something should be done, even though he's the budget analyst for the Board of Supervisors, it was pretty much taken as a given that was going to happen. Does that no longer happen anymore? Is that no longer the path anymore?
I apologize. I'm not that familiar with that process that you describe, and
Okay, well,
I
if
really
you-
don't.
Then it doesn't exist anymore. Then and that's okay, and that's fine. Things change, and I've been out of it for a while. But so getting back then to the bottom line that Chair Rennie was talking about, if we make a case that something should indeed be done differently for us, that we not have the 1.5%, or we even get more than what we have now, if we make that case to you, and you say, yeah, they're right, are you going to go then and advocate for us with the mayor's office?
So I'm an analyst in the mayor's budget office. My direct supervisor is the deputy director, Melissa Whitehouse, and
Who's that?
Melissa Whitehouse, and the budget director for the city is Kate Howard. And we will work with departments again to review their submissions. We will encourage departments to find ways to meet targets. As far as advocacy, my role really is more technical.
Okay. No, I think I think I found it in terms of your answer. So those two individuals whom you just mentioned, would you say their names again?
Melissa Whitehouse is the deputy director,
Right.
and Kate Howard is the director.
Okay. Those are the two people who would then be having some discussions ultimately with the mayor's office that might or might not result in us getting something more than the recommendation is now. They would have the role to say to the mayor, no, in this case, we think you should go along with the department and not have the 1.5. Not that they're going to do it, but that's part of their function. I'm just looking for what the path is now. Have I identified it correctly?
It's a little challenging to advise or comment.
No, I don't want to put you on the spot.
Hypothetical, but when the departments submit their budgets, that's really our vehicle for those discussions, and I'm not sure I'm answering your question around how to get more for the department. I don't know that I can. We will work with all departments and try to submit a balanced budget.
Okay. Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you very much. Appreciate your coming here today to help give us that guidance. Ms. Pelham, it's probably a little unfair, but do you have anything that you want to say in regard to this particular agenda item and what thoughts you may have on it?
Yes, thank you, and good morning, Commissioners. It is very, very good to be with you here, sitting in this chair today. I think I very much hearken back to your earlier comment. This is day 2 for me, and I clearly have a lot to learn about how the Commission is operating. I need to understand our current operations and procedures and programs more fully before I can give you a really thoughtful comment on the budget. But with that, I would just wanted to share a bit of my philosophy about approaching the budget, because I think it's echoing both what I'm hearing from the Commission as well as what I'm hearing from the Mayor's representative. And my experience tells me that it is very important to both understand and appreciate the fiscal realities that any public organization is facing in these days. And so those things are very serious factors, I think, that we need to start with as a premise. Secondly, though, clearly understanding our current resources, our current programmatic demands, recent programmatic demands that have been created, and how that's affecting our ability to deliver on the voters' mandate for this agency. So I'm very much looking forward to very deeply diving into the operations of the Commission and trying to respect the time frame that we've got. I know it's not an easy one. But it's important to really understand our programs and the demands to be able to be thoughtful about what a budget recommendation would look like to you all at the next meeting. So I'm appreciating the time to do that. The goal that I would have, however, is understanding both the realities of the fiscal constraints that the city may be facing, is to also understand what we need to do to right-size the organization. And right-size may mean that we do need to articulate the need very clearly for additional resources. It's important to me that we understand what those resources are and what those resources would do if we were provided them. And in that, I think it's important to articulate how the resources that we would be seeking meet or advance the mission of the Ethics Commission. What are the indicators of success? How will we know that, in fact, when budget decisions are made to provide resources to an organization, we deliver on what we say we're going to do? That's, I think, an important contract we have with policymakers. And then finally, I think it's also important, ultimately, that if it comes down to a budget that simply cannot provide the resources that we believe are necessary to fully meet our mandate, then it's important, because the information we should have developed through this process helps, I think, policymakers for the future, as well as the public, manage expectations about what kinds of trade-offs that we have to make and will be faced to make going forward if we're not able to fully meet the requirements of the job. So that's a bit of a long answer, but those are some of the elements that I think are really important to look to as we develop a recommendation for your consideration. I think this morning's hearing and being able to hear from individuals from the community about what they see the needs are for the Commission will be important in formulating our thinking at the staff level. But I'm really very much looking forward to really taking a deep dive and trying to be as rigorous in this approach to you and to other policymakers as we go forward. Budgets are never easy. Budgets are always fundamentally political choices about where very, very limited resources go. But it is important, I think, for us to make our best case with the best information we have.
Do any of the commissioners have any questions of Ms. Pelham? Thank you very much, and I will now call for...
Sorry. Chair Rooney, I have a couple of questions. And I know that you didn't prepare this memo, Ms. Pelham, so feel free to tell me that you don't know, and we can get this figured out. I'm looking on the second page under Election Campaign Fund. And it says... in that first paragraph, with 6 seats on the Board of Supervisors up for election in 2016, the projected disbursement in the upcoming fiscal year is about $2.7 million, and that's coming from the Election Campaign Fund, which is separate in some respects from our budget. Does that include the 15% administrative fee?
If I can have a moment, I may have the answer on with the staff here. I don't know myself. Can you give me just a moment? 15% can be.
Yeah, that's what.
Yeah. Let me just defer to City Attorney Andrew Shen for a moment.
Yeah, as the second paragraph explains, the administrative aspects or the administrative costs of implementing the public financing program can be taken from the fund itself.
No, I understand that, but Is this number $2.7 million, is that inclusive of that 15% fee or not?
I would think so, but we can dive deeper into that.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll have
to
get back to you. I don't know if that number does include it. I would think it does, but I don't want to misspeak.
Okay, so typically we take the administrative 15% fee and gotcha. Okay. Okay. Thank you.
Chair Kuhn.
Commissioner Andrews.
I'm struggling because I would, and I think we can probably get into it at our next meeting. But what was a very useful piece of information, and I again recognize, Executive Director, that you didn't prepare this report and were not around to respond to requests in the past, is, it's always good to see budget to actuals, and then ultimately, if you could have a variance line column year over year. And on the Ethics Commission budget, you see at the bottom of the sheet, we have for 14-15 budgeted to actuals, and I would just add one more line of a variance. It would be good to see a kind of a comparative, possibly 3, go back as far as 5, but 3 would be sufficient, budgeted to actuals to see where there possibly were cost savings, because it's interesting that the delta between the budgeted to actuals on 14-15 was about a little over $73,000, and that in many ways represents year 2 of our 1.5 reduction that we would need. But certainly it would more than suffice. And I suspect that it probably is cost savings in personnel, that's turnover, that's generally where you find that kind of savings, but it would be good to see that first as a part of our own analysis, to have an understanding of really what we were budgeted for, because that's ultimately what we're going to get a pushback on, which is we could very well request increased dollars, but if it turns out that you actually didn't use the dollars that were budgeted beforehand, I would then, as you can imagine, one would come back and say, well, tell me how you were able to or not able to spend the dollars that were appropriated to you in years past. So for us to be fully prepared for this conversation, both for ourselves and then ultimately one that we would have with the Mayor's Budget Office, it would be good to see what our budget to actuals look like for the last 3 years, and then variances on that.
All right, I will take public comment on item number 2. And I should say for the record that I believe that Ms. Pelham and at least myself and maybe all members of the commission have received a number of communications from Friends of Ethics concerning the subject matter, and to the extent that you want to use your time judiciously, it's probably to whatever additions you want to make, because both of us have looked at them, and I think Ms. Pelham is prepared to respond to them.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I'm Larry Bush from Friends of Ethics and was a member of the civil grand jury that also worked on ethics. I'm just going to hand across copies of the charter amendments that I referenced in my emails, which are what the budgets are supposed to consist of, the biennial budget requirements, and the requirement for a commission secretary. I've added to that the draft that the civil grand jury prepared on what an ethics commission secretary's duties would be. And so I have copies of that for everyone.
Thank you.
Moving past all of those issues. It may be no longer true, but when I was working in the mayor's office, it was true that there was a separation of powers when you did a budget, so that the mayor's office did not do the budget for the courts. That was done by the Board of Supervisors. The mayor's office didn't even touch it because it was considered to be that the mayor's office and his operations were subject to the court's scrutiny, and it would be wrong to do that. If that's still the policy, it seems to me that the Ethics Commission is in a position to argue to the mayor's office that, like the courts, you are a body that oversees the operation of city departments, whether it's official misconduct or whether it's the whistleblower or anything else that you'd care to name, and that you are therefore subject to a review which was done in the past by the Board of Supervisors, and that would allow you more flexibility than the February 22nd deadline if you can show that that's still the policy and still something that works. Just in terms of spelling out what the budget would and would not do, that's a critical importance in our view. In the past, when budget cuts were made, things like reporting of contracts by city department heads was stopped in terms of being sent over to the Ethics Commission for 2 years. There was a memo that went to all city department heads and to the mayor saying, don't send us copies of the contracts you're signing, which was, of course, a dubious decision that was never approved by the commission. The same way, the staff at that time made a decision to make a low priority of auditing major donors, although major donors are, of course, the major amount of money that's going into political campaigns. So I would urge you to take a close look at that. The mayor's budget is suggesting that you take a look at cuts, but I would urge you to also take a look at revenue. You have the option of contracting out if that's what you decide to do. You're missing an auditor position. It may be that you want to contract out some of the auditing. It may want to contract out some enforcement. You've got people like Gary Winnick, who's very proficient at that and who does this in other cities, and so you could contract out and perhaps save some money. Also, you can do more electronic filing. The contracts is one example. It's still done by. My time is up. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners, and I want to first start by welcoming our new Executive Director. It's delightful to see her, as well as thank again the Commission for its hard work on that question. I did want to mention a whole series of things, so I'll have to be brief. The first thing you should know is that the best practices model, or what we consider as advocates, the best practices model for ethics bodies in the United States is the New York City model. And that model, the budget goes directly to the New York City Council, which is a large body of like 135 people. But in any event, in this case, it would go directly to the the board. And the way the mayor in New York handles it is they put on reserve the entire request of the ethics budget, because the process there ensures that all decision making regarding the budget is done in public session and is on the record, and not behind closed doors in the mayor's office where things are essentially locked in, as you've pointed out, I think, essentially, when it's submitted to the board, oftentimes it's a matter of trade-offs at the board to cut some program over here to give you the money that you need, and then it becomes a much tighter process. What you might consider doing is advocating that you're a quasi-judicial body and that you should fall under that judicial model that Mr. Bush just detailed. I also wanted to mention that in the past you have had strategic or annual strategic planning meetings. Sometimes these were done on a Saturday morning. They were open to the public. I would attend. Everyone would attend. They would be informal, and they would basically do some brainstorming in a much more open process about where this commission's, what this commission's role is in the city. They would look at bigger questions, and the mayor is advocating that in his budget, given the new two-year process. I also wanted to say it's odd that, with many of you comprised being lawyers, and that that the commission has a legal mandate to have a commission secretary. You might want to really advocate that at this time to the mayor, because I think the law is on your side, and it's odd that as an enforcement agency leveling sanctions against violators, that you yourself is in essentially violation of the charter itself. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioners, and welcome, Executive Director Pelham. My name is Hildegard Fullo, and I've served on 2 civil grand juries and am a member of Friends of Ethics. The proposed Ethics Commission budget is not reflective of a top regulatory agency aspiring high ethical standards with a robust activity and efficiency. Ms. Pelham, as Ethics' new Executive Director, I would not presume to know how you set your priorities, but given your experience and excellent resume, I trust that you will recognize the importance of working with your commissioners to rehabilitate the city's whistleblower program in the area of employer retaliation complaints. Rehabilitation seems an appropriate term given this agency's history and due to the fact that the Commission established several policies earlier on, but those policies were either ignored or completely eliminated by your predecessor. An example is 215's Proposition C on last November's ballot, which won by a 75% voter mandate and reestablished a policy that had been dropped in 2009. The city's whistleblower program, administered by the Comptroller's Office, is a Trojan horse that undermines and dilutes ethical standards. The program is not working the way it should because it lacks ethical safeguards and suffers dysfunction, due in part to inadequate staffing, which I believe is deliberate. Civil grand jury investigations have reported whistleblowers receive no satisfaction when filing complaints with this city's program, and complainants are forced to pursue other methods of recourse. The Whistleblower Protection Ordinance offers no protection. The only recourse in far too many cases is a lawsuit against the city, with the mandatory payment paid by taxpayer dollars. To quote from the 2014-2015 Civil Grand Jury Report on the Whistleblower Program, I quote, "The chief reason why whistleblower retaliation complaints have fared so poorly, the Whistleblower Protection Ordinance protects only those who make disclosures in-house. Thus, a city employee who discloses government wrongdoing by contacting the media, California Attorney General, or the FBI is not protected under the Whistleblower City Protection Ordinance." Investigations have proven retaliation complaints that remain in-house are dismissed and tossed into the abyss labeled "no violations found." Those guilty of fraud, malfeasance, abuse, and other forms of unethical conduct are not held accountable. Whistleblower employee retaliation is a priority issue worthy of this Commission's attention. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Bob Planthold. I'm going to offer comments based on the December 17th memo that was, issued after Jesse Minardi resigned. But I'm going to draw upon history. And this history is before any of you were on the commission, before anybody on ethics staff was hired, before the assigned legal counsel was involved with ethics, before the current controller was even in the Comptroller's office. So this is prehistoric in a sense, and it's going to require almost archival research. Back in 1997 or 1998, when I was an officer of the Sunshine Task Force, we came to Ethics Commission, then chaired by retired Judge Isabella Grant, and asked for them to have a half-time commission secretary, and we would have a half-time task force secretary, because at the time there was no budget for a secretary for Sunshine. That's still the case. The Sunshine Task Force Secretary time is squeezed with no funding. So you would do well to realize there's a history of saying a part-time commission secretary. But now I want to go into the history of the questions you folks ask about budget negotiations, because when I was an officer, we did adopt our recommended budget after the suggested recommended deadline. And our executive director then, Ginny Vida, went to the controller, Ed Harrington. Realize if every department submits everything on 22 February, they can't go through every department's budget in 1 week. That's just realistically impossible. There's got to be lag time to consider MTA, Public Health, Mayor's Office of Housing, and all these other agencies. So in the practical sense of administrative work, if you adopted a budget on 28 February, you could be okay. Still, we went to talk to the then controller to talk about this. I want to go further on this, that the idea of this budget memo showing you've got unfilled positions, and the previous executive director, Mr. St. Croix, waived or suspended certain monitoring and enforcement actions due to lack of staffing, that you ought to consider. Put into your budget that we can't do certain functions because we lack the staff. And the city, mayor, supervisors, you commissions could all be sued for not doing your duty. Keep that in mind, please. There's so many ways that you can deal with this. When I was an officer, we passed one budget begrudgingly. Then I went to the Board of Supervisors and negotiated, lobbied, and I got them to, in the add-back session, put in half-time staffer. So even if you submit a budget on 28 February, and you ought to, I suggest, add in all the positions still needed, and then individually work in the add back. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Commissioners. Mark Solomon from Friends of Ethics, and to the Executive Director, through the Chair, welcome to the deep end of the pool. We're sitting here in San Francisco with a record high budget. We're seeing record business activity, and yet we're being told by the mayor that we need to cut the budget of of all the departments, including the one that actually oversees the corruption that's leading us to a situation of the highest revenues, yet we're seeing cuts in our budgets. This agency, being the sleeping watchdog, is what has led to the political and economic situation right now, where we have private interests, both for-profit and non-profit, half of which are in this room right now, who stake claims on the general fund as their private property. And in order for that nut to be cracked, this commission has to adopt a posture where it's willing to stand up to that. And it's going to mean telling the mayor no. We're going to need to chart a course over the next 5 years or so to have this commission meet its charter mandates to provide services to San Franciscans. And that's going to take some time, it's going to take some effort, and this commission, the political appointees here, are going to have to back up our new executive director when we go to the executive branch and make that case to ensure that this agency has its proper funding. I think that the commission secretary is a really good idea because that facilitates participation and extends the commission's reach to the public. But we have to realize here that the nature of the corruption here is so insidious that it's going to involve pushback when we do that. I think we've seen during the St. Croix regime where accommodations have been made to go ahead and cover for things, and that's resulted in what we're seeing now. But as we look out in the city, we're seeing record business activity, record construction activity, record fees and payments made to the city, yet we're also seeing things like the America's Cup from a few years ago, things like the Super Bowl happening right now, where the government is essentially shoveling out public resources into private pockets and then going ahead and pulling its pockets out and saying, oh, we're poor, we have to cut budgets elsewhere. That can't happen because when this department's budget is cut, that means that for every other department that is supposed to provide city services, you're seeing corruption go ahead and nibble away at basically our money and diverting that into private hands. It's a really tough job. I'm so glad you took the job because you come to this commission with a track record of believing in the mission. And that's not always been the case of people who have been leading the department. And it's going to be tough. There's going to be pushback. But Friends of Ethics has your back, and I hope the commission has the executive director's back when we go ahead and stand up to the mayor in this case. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right. Not hearing any further public comment, I think we have understand that on item number 2, there's no decision today. It was really just an informative decision. I appreciate both the written and oral input that we've received from the public, and I can assure you that it'll be taken seriously. Turning to item number 3.
Sorry, Commissioner Sherwini.
Go ahead.
I have some comments that I'd like to be taken into account by the staff as we come up with a proposal. I do think we ought to strongly consider adding back or proposing to add back the positions we're missing. I think we've really been struggling on the investigative side, and we've been without this staff person for a long time. And whether that requires some rejiggering of the of who reports to whom, adding another person. I mean, I think you need to really think about how we can make our investigative unit more efficient and more effective. I think on the auditing side, we do a good job on the auditing side, but it takes too long. And so we need to really think about how, for the sake of the city, for the sake of electeds, for the sake of everyone who cares about our processes, that we need to do it more efficiently. It takes far too long for audits to take place. And we need to figure out what we can do from a budgetary standpoint to help with that process. On the commission secretary point, I hear what Friends of Ethics is saying. I think I don't think that requires that we hire an independent commission secretary. I think certainly a member of the staff could serve that role if we deem that necessary, because a lot of this is Of course, it would be great to have a commission secretary, but we need to prioritize. Obviously, we're facing budget pressure, and I think, in my view, enforcement and auditing are more important than a commission secretary. Certainly a separate commission secretary. I think someone else on the staff could fulfill that role. I think with kind of a new leadership, maybe there's a view that that people who think we need it may deem that we ultimately don't need it. So, in my view, that's a secondary priority. Thank you.
Commissioner Keene.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And Commissioner Herr, I completely agree with the first part of what you said, and I couldn't be more pleased in terms of your statement that these particular functions that are not being done in terms of auditing and investigation, they have to be done. And in order to do that, the resources have to be there for us to do it. And for us to just sort of compliantly go along with this viewpoint, well, there's a formula here, and the formula is you, Ethics Commission, like every other department, are just going to cut 1.5%. Given the fact that we need to add a lot of resources, not cut anything, for us to just docilely go along with that is totally unacceptable. It's completely unacceptable from any kind of standpoint of us doing our job and for the city as well. I agree entirely with a couple of the comments that were made relating to the state of the city in terms of the political activities in the city and the lack of oversight that has existed in these political activities in the city, particularly during the course of the tenure of our former executive director. And to quote one of the people, the city has slid into a fair amount of corruption, tremendously soft corruption, but corruption. It's pay to play. It's a game of bribery, whether or not we could actually identify it as bribery. It's there, and it's been there now for some period of time. And this is the group, our group is the group that should be ferreting that out, should be getting on top of that and reversing that. If we just go ahead and go along with this docilely with these instructions, also in the face of one of the observations that was made, that the city has record revenues and records amount of money coming in that don't, in my opinion, justify any kind of cuts whatsoever. I was in city government during the latter part of the last century when revenues were way down and we had to cut constantly because there were no revenues, there were no money. There's lots of money now. The city has lots of money. And to me, having been in that situation 20 years ago where there was no money and we had to do cuts of 1.5%, to now be back and look and have the mayor's office say, even though we got this big pot of money, you all still have to cut. I've seen no justification for that, except certainly in terms of this particular committee, to keep this committee as a completely castrated body without any kind of ability to do its job. Mr. Chair, I respectfully request that we go ahead and submit a budget that has the enforcement mechanisms in it that Commissioner Herr identified, as well as a commission secretary. We need a commission secretary. And as was pointed out by Mr. Marsteller and others, we're violating the law since it's part of the charter that says we should have a commission secretary. And for us to say, well, we're not going to have one. We, the group that supposedly enforce the charter, to say we're going to violate it, that's pretty bad. So let's come up with whatever the budget is for the things that we just discussed, that Commissioner Herr discussed and that I've said. And it's going to be a lot more than the budget that we have now. It's not going to be any 1.5% cut. Let's submit that budget to the mayor's office. with a forceful justification of why we need those increases, and let's fight for it, and let's get it.
All right, thank you. And I might mention, Commissioner Burr, that we are meeting shortly with the controller to discuss, among other things, the fact that by mandate, the controller's office is supposed to assist in the audit process and has indicated a willingness to do it, and it may well be coming out of those meetings that there can be a reanalysis of who's going to be doing the audits and how quickly they get done.
Thank you.
Commissioner Andrews?
I just want to go on record to say that I fully support Commissioner Keene's recommendation to move forward with the proposal, particularly in light of the fact of all of what has been said today and what we continue to face, the increasing pressures. I think we have a moment in time with a new executive director, and I, for one, am looking forward to working with Ms. Pelham. And we've heard from the public in the past, and it's very clear what they are looking for from us. And a lot of what has been a little bit of a hamstring for us has been a lot of what was around another executive director. I think we addressed that. This is our second opportunity, our next opportunity that is in front of us that deals with resources, and I think that we should do that. So I fully support that recommendation and make myself available to assist in that where it is appropriate.
I think there's unanimity on the comments that have been made by all the commissioners, and I know that Ms. Pelham will take them to heart and respond accordingly. All right, let's move to item number 3, which is a discussion and possible action regarding the Commission's implementation of Proposition C, which imposes registration and reporting requirements on expenditure lobbyists. Pat, do you want to address that issue at this moment, or do you want Ms. Pelham?
Chair Rennie, members of the Commission, Ms. Pelham. Regarding implementation of Prop C, on December 7th, an interested persons meeting was held, and the comments are reflected in the staff report before you. There's a second interested persons meeting that's scheduled for the 13th, same time, from noon to 1:30, and that meeting will be noticed.
All right. I would say in regard to the interested persons meeting on the 13th, I had the good fortune of being able to attend the interested persons meeting, initial one in December. Unfortunately, I absolutely can't make the one on the 13th, and I would urge one or two commissioners, if they can fit it into their schedule, to appear and hear the comments and assist in Ms. Peterson and assist the Commission in drafting at least some interim regulations, which obviously may have to be adjusted as we go forward, because we have to have something in place by the 1st of February to give some guidance to the various groups that are going to be obligated to report. And the reason I suggest one or two is that if we go to 3, then it becomes a commission meeting and has to be noticed and all sorts of requirements. But if one or two could attend, it would be helpful. All right, I will, at this point, do any commissioners have any comments that they wish to make on this item? Commissioner Herr?
I had a couple questions and some comments on the second page, the memo, the nonprofit registration fee. Can you describe the issue there in a little bit more detail?
Yeah, so if you look at the copy of the ordinance that was included in the meeting packet, if you look at page 16 towards the very top, under sub 3, so the very first few lines, it says the Ethics Commission shall waive all registration fees for any full-time employees of a tax-exempt nonprofit organization. And there was just questions raised at the interested persons meeting about how that applies to expenditure lobbyists when the expenditure lobbyist is an organization versus an employee. So contact lobbyists under the current or previous iteration of the lobbyist ordinance was an individual by individual thing. So those persons could be employees and thus could receive that waiver of registration fee. And there's just a little bit lack of clarity about how that would apply to expenditure lobbyists, which are not necessarily just individuals, but could be an individual or an organization. I think it's a relatively minor issue that I think we could probably clean up via reg, although probably the best solution going forward would be obviously amending the ordinance to provide absolute clarity on the issue.
Okay.
But I didn't sense my impression from the meeting, and certainly Chair Rennie can weigh in, is I don't think anyone disagreed with that proposal or addressing that confusion.
Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. In addition, under number 4, I mean, I shared a lot of these concerns. I think I shared these concerns when we were considering the actual proposition, and I do think it's a problem not just for nonprofits, but in general, to determine exactly which expenditures count, particularly if they're initially purposed for something else and then ultimately used to lobby. I agree that we should provide some clear regulation here. In particular, I favor more bright line, even if it means we're not capturing everything that we possibly could capture. And I know there's going to be disagreement about that in this room, but I mean, especially for entities that aren't going to have a lot of money to be spending on these things, we need clarity. And I think we can do that, a lot of that, by regulation. Okay, I think I'll reserve any further comments for after public comment. Thank you, Chair Rennie.
Any other commissioner have any initial comments? All right, I'll call for public comment on item number 3. And again, I would make the same admonition. We have received a number of written materials on this particular item, and we have or will read them carefully, and we'll consider the comments, and it'd probably be the best use of your time to elaborate to the extent that you think it necessary. Thank you.
Commissioners, thank you. Ian Lewis, Research Director for Unite Here, local to the hotel and restaurant workers. I was at the interested persons meeting, and as I said there, the text of Proposition C is replete with ambiguities, and if read very, very literally and to its maximal extent, would create practical impossibility for many organizations to fully comply, absent clear guidance from this body. So I'm here, and I've circulated a letter asking for very clear regulation along the lines, I think, of what Commissioner Herr was just describing. Just to call out a couple items, I'd urge you to make the reporting very simple and straightforward and minimal, and in particular only require monthly reporting when the threshold has been triggered, rather than every month from here into eternity once you have 1 month triggered that threshold. Another is an ambiguity in what constitutes that threshold, the $2,500 amount.
I think, there are many organizations that counsel individuals or people on particular cases, which in aggregate might add up to $2,500 a month. But I think the intent of voters when they passed this was organizations spending $2,500 to influence a single legislative or administrative action. And so I'd like you to make that clear, that it is a single action that triggers that event and that reporting, and not an aggregate set of actions. Another is to exempt from reporting staff who spend less than 10% of their time. That's an FPPC standard, and one thing I think you should adopt here. Absent something like that, many organizations would have to follow, create, minute-by-minute tracking of every staff person's time every day of the week, even when we know that they are not individually going to add up to a great deal in influencing any one activity. There are other issues that I call out and don't have time for spoken comment here, but I'd urge you again to make this clear and draw those bright lines that Commissioner Herr referred to, because we saw in this last electoral cycle multi-billion-dollar corporations filing, frankly, frivolous complaints with the sole purpose of hamstringing community and worker-based organizations. And without that clear guidance, Proposition C creates a huge open field for more of that activity, which I know is not the intent of voters to tie up community organizations in unnecessary red tape. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Rachel Richmond. I'm the Policy Director at Professional and Technical Engineers, Local 21. I want to welcome the new Executive Director and thank you for the opportunity to speak before you. Our union represents 4,000 city employees, and we are in complete agreement with the concerns raised by the Hotel Workers Local 2 union. We would also like clarification of the exemption for activities related to contract negotiations and administrative decisions that affect working conditions. Because, for example, we represent the Board of Supervisors' aides, so we might be filing a grievance that materially will benefit them. And or, for example, we are contractually entitled to certain health care and retirement benefits and due process, which means that we interact with the Civil Service Commission, the Health Services Board, and the Retirement Board concerning the benefits that our members are entitled to in the contract. So we would like, we will give you a list of examples, and we would like clarification from the Commission about what will be covered under that umbrella of contract negotiations, working conditions, and other administrative matters. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. Debbie Lerman from the San Francisco Human Services Network. First of all, I do want to refer once again to a memo that I submitted to this Commission on behalf of HSN on November 23rd that summarizes most of our comments on this measure. I want to reiterate once again that we have a very sincere and troubled request into this Commission to actually consider, discuss, and vote on a nonprofit exemption. The complex rules around lobbying and common misconceptions about nonprofits' rights to lobby often deter nonprofits from advocacy at all, especially small ones. I will tell you, I know it's anecdotal, but most of the organizations that I've mentioned and talked to about Prop C don't say, oh, no, now we're going to have to register. They say, oh, no, now we're going to have to track our spending and advocate less. So that is a factual truth, and we are going to see less advocacy. We also would like to see this commission consider an amendment to the $2,500 threshold, which is really absurdly low in this day and age and does not increase with inflation. In the meantime, while we would love to see you talk about that, we're right now looking at the regulations, and I want to credit Mr. Minardi with doing an excellent job of summarizing our comments, the comments of the community at the interested persons meeting, and we hope that you will adopt the community's suggestions, particularly the $500 fee for a nonprofit exemption. This is a big hurdle for small organizations and would disempower the low-income community organizations. The fiscal sponsor problem. There should not be a duty to report if you don't spend $2,500 in a month. We shouldn't have to, if you go over 1 month and the next month you spend $50, why should you have to report those little tiny amounts of expenditures? And then we hope that you will address the need for bright lines around members, member communications, reports, newsletters, donor letters, those types of things that we need to know on a very bright line whether those things are going to trigger reporting requirements or not. We did a report back in 2001. It was not for the purpose of lobbying, but it cost us a lot of money, and it produced all kinds of data that I still use 15 years later, often in advocacy situations. And so we need to know, how do we deal with those kinds of things? Thank you for working with the community. Thank you for offering us so many opportunities to weigh in at this point. And we look forward to continuing to work with you and with the new executive director. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today. My name is Sarah Matlin, and I'm bilingual counsel for Alliance for Justice's Boulder Advocacy Program. Alliance for Justice is a national association of more than 100 public interest organizations that strengthens the ability of community organizations to influence public policy. Boulder Advocacy is our initiative that works with nonprofit organizations to provide training, learning resources, and free technical assistance about nonprofit advocacy laws. At Alliance for Justice, we understand that nonprofit organizations are vital in representing the voices of diverse communities in public policy decisions. Boulder Advocacy demystifies tax, lobbying, and election laws so nonprofit advocacy organizations and their staff members and volunteers can confidently advocate for community change. Nonprofits that engage in advocacy must already comply with federal laws, California laws, local laws, and jurisdictions throughout California. All of these jurisdictions define lobbying differently and require different reporting of different activities and different expenses on different schedules. Navigating these many overlapping yet distinct laws is confusing, especially for smaller organizations. It will be now hard to help San Francisco community organizations feel confident about advocating for community change in San Francisco. Even though it was well-intentioned, Measure C adds a significant burden of yet more registration and reporting for nonprofits. As Measure C is written, it may make many nonprofits decide it's just not worth the cost of compliance or the risk of failing to comply. And we hope the Prop C will be modified in the future to exempt nonprofit organizations or at least increase the expenditure threshold. We will work to help nonprofits understand the new law, but we need your help in structuring Measure C to compliance to be as manageable as possible. We want to highlight 6 recommendations. First, Alliance for Justice does recommend that the existing registration fee waivers for nonprofit contract lobbyists be extended to nonprofit organizations that qualify as expenditure lobbyists. Second, to decrease the burden of needless reporting, we do recommend that nonprofit organizations that qualify in certain months as expenditure lobbyists only be required to file reports in the months they qualify as expenditure lobbyists. And months they do not qualify, they should not have to submit reports. Third, we recommend you adopt the California definition of legislative or administrative action, which essentially excludes enforcement of existing legislation or regulation. If an organization is communicating with city officials, trying to bring about enforcement or raise the awareness of existing laws or regulations, and it's not attempting to pass a new ordinance or implement a new regulation, that communication should not count towards an organization's expenditure threshold. I have more comments here about making sure that the cost of research and reports that are not undertaking for lobbying do not count toward the lobbying threshold. And I recommend you adopt the exemption for newsletters as lobbying communication that California exempts as well. And finally, on behalf of various fiscal sponsors who enable small community organizations to exist and grow, that you count their project numbers rather than their overall organizational numbers. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello again, Oliver Luby commenting on my own behalf. First, I wanted to express congratulations and thanks to the Commission for the successful restoration of expenditure lobbying disclosure. Seriously, bravo. It was really great to see this work and a lot of your work from last year. On the subject of Prop C's implementation, your staff report covers much of the topics for which new regulations will be needed. For now, the one response I would offer to those topics is that the definition of member should be fairly narrow, not overly broad. After 2000's Prop 34 created member communication exemptions for IE reporting and other campaign finance principles, we saw abuses, intentional use of the concept basically to skirt the rules. And similar problems will ensue if expenditure lobbying disclosure with expenditure lobbying if disclosure, if member is defined too broadly. The nitty-gritty is too complicated for right now, but more on that later. On the subject of continuous e-filing, that exists in the campaign finance disclosure context for very good reasons. The gaps that are created if you exempt reporting when there's no activity are problematic for researchers, problematic for compliance, and so I would not recommend. I would take a keen eye on that. I would be slow to create that kind of gap in the reporting. And then one necessary regulation not covered by your staff report is clarifying what the definition of expenditure lobbyist means by other persons. The definition states that an expenditure lobbyist is any person who makes payments totaling $2,500 or more in a calendar month to solicit, request, or urge other persons to communicate directly with an officer of the city and county in order to, et cetera, influence legislative and administrative action. The definition then goes on to list various exemptions, notably payments to contact lobbyists, but the exemptions do not entirely mirror the exemptions for the definition of contact lobbyist. Therefore, if any persons means anyone other than the single individual or entity making those expenditures, the definition of expenditure lobbyist potentially overlaps with activity that would otherwise be contact lobbying if it were not exempt. This is stuff like union activity, nonprofits making contacts on their own behalf, and contract stuff, newsletters. I don't think any of us wants that result. And whether or not an exemption to the contact lobbyist definition is good public policy, you should not mix the concepts of contact lobbying and expenditure lobbying disclosure. There should be a bright line between those concepts. And so I think one way to draw that line would be to define other person, to exclude agents of expenditure lobbyists that are engaging in this exempt contact lobbying activity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Again, Fujioka with Chinatown Community Development Center, and I want to strongly support the recommendations by Local 2 and the Alliance for Justice as solving a number of very knotty questions that face us in trying to understand what is expenditure lobbying activity. Because in order to comply, we need to get clarity about that, and I think that a number of their suggestions would assist. Let me give you two examples of the kind of activities that our organization does on a routine basis. One is we're trying to understand and understand what are the situations for tenants in the city. We track evictions in the city. And in a sense, that's research. Ultimately, a couple of years down the road, that may ultimately result in advocacy for strengthening the rent ordinance or dealing with rent ordinance rules. We don't have any idea at the time that we're doing that tracking of evictions in the city whether or not that's going to ultimately result in advocacy before the rent board to strengthen the rent ordinance. So I think that we need to get clarity, and hopefully, I think the recommendations made previously would exempt that activity from being considered retroactively expenditure lobbying activity. Let me give you another example. One of the things we do regularly is we assist non-English speaking tenants to petition the rent board for relief from illegal evictions or rent increases. Those matters ultimately may get to the rent board, and we need to assist the tenants in that situation. Is that expenditure lobbying activity when we appear before the rent board, assisting non-English speaking tenants to be able to represent themselves in challenging an illegal rent increase or an eviction? I think not. I don't think that comports with the description that was in the ballot argument for Proposition C submitted by the Commission, that was not a payment that is our staff providing translation assistance to tenants. It doesn't appear to me that should be that was the intent of the legislation when the voters passed it. That was a payment made that is our support, our staff time that may amount to a significant amount of time given the amount of times that these commission hearings take. So I think that the recommendations made by some of the previous speakers would address those solutions by exempting the activity as expenditure lobbying activity. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Fieber. I'm the interim director of the San Francisco Tenants Union. So I wanted to bring you the perspective of a very small organization and how I think Prop C is going to affect us. We have 1.5 staff members. Our annual budget is $120,000 a year. Last November was my first time doing the slate mailer card, and I realize they're different, but I think that the reporting issues are going to be similar. And so since it was my first year, I was completely paranoid about getting it right and not getting any fines. And it turned out it wasn't so clear because we had one slate mailer that was walked, one that was mailed. You had to set up a separate committee for the walked one and get a new FPPC number. It took me like 20 phone calls with the Secretary of State and Ethics, and I was getting different answers from both of them. And I missed deadlines, and it wasn't fun. But now I know what I'm doing. I'm not complaining about all that. But in the end, we lost about $4,000 after the political consultants, the lawyers, the accountants were done with us, and that actually hurts us a lot. So I think my point is I agree with the memo that was circulated with the other nonprofits. I think the voters thought it sounded really simple when they proposed it, and it does, maybe if you have a staff attorney. But to me, it seems like it's a boon for elite experts to guide you through the process. And so I just urge you to clarify the definitions and to consider the limitations of small organizations like mine who advocate on everyday issues, tenants' rights. The city has 64% population tenants, and we have no financial gain in that. We're just doing our mission. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hello, Commissioners. Larry Bush from Friends of Ethics. I'm just hand out some things that you already may have. Just to clarify things, one is a timetable of the process by which the expenditure lobbyists came on before the voters, beginning with the civil grand jury votes and then the hearings that took place at the Ethics Commission and so on and so forth. A second point that I would wanted to refer to is that's been raised that there is duplicate reporting because some nonprofits file Form 990s. They are IRS tax exempt, and that is true. And on a Form 990, it does ask you, do you spend any money on lobbying or on political activity? And if you do, then you are supposed to fill out the Form 990 Schedule C, and here's a copy of the Schedule C so that you can see how complete that is. Part of the problem that people are having a hard time getting their hands around is what is a nonprofit? If you go to GuideStar, which is where most people file their 990s, there are 6,592 nonprofits registered in San Francisco. They are of all kinds of sizes. It's the PG&E Foundation. Chevron has 4 foundations, all of which are nonprofits. You have community activist groups like the San Francisco Parks Alliance or SPUR, all of which are nonprofits. Then you have nonprofits that receive some public financing. So the question comes down to, when you're talking about excluding all nonprofits, are you suddenly going to exclude every nonprofit that falls in a Form 990? For that matter, if you're a nonprofit that files through a fiscal sponsor, you don't file a 990 that's available to the public. You certainly don't file a Schedule C. So we don't know who those people are and what it is that they're doing. Most of the groups that have been appearing before the Commission do not file 990s that are publicly available and do not make those disclosures available, even though they're concerned about the fact that they have to dual report. So I think it's a fair question. We agree with many of the comments that have been made, especially from the unions, about what constitutes membership, what constitutes the bright line between prior work product and how it's used now. That is something that Commissioner Herr raised at the hearings before, which was addressed in part in the legislation. And we will reserve till the interested persons meeting to deal with those in more specifics. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question to Mr. Bush? So, in your view, and you may not agree with this dichotomy of options, but if the choice were to exempt certain nonprofits that that had revenue or budgets of less than a certain amount, or have very bright line rules that would not capture a lot of the activity that I know Friends of Ethics is concerned about, which of those two choices do you think would be more effective in your view?
A nonprofit with a smaller budget. We looked at what happened in Los Angeles. They have an exemption for nonprofits that receive public funding for the federal, state, or local governments and which serve indigent people and do not charge for those services. And we suggested that at the interested persons meeting. And it was rejected by some of the people who've spoken here today, saying that doesn't cover us because we don't actually serve people. We do advocacy. And I don't really understand whether they drew the distinction between advocacy and lobbying, but they had in their own mind a distinction. When the issue of exempting nonprofits was before the Board of Supervisors on direct contacting, the request that was first made before the Government Audit and Operations Committee was an exemption for nonprofits that provide human services and housing and which receive public funding. And Supervisor Chu, who was author of this, agreed to that. And they came back in May with the language. But what they came back with was a total exemption for all nonprofits. You just had to say you were a nonprofit. So there was no distinction whatsoever. We look at that as being overly broad. But that's the one that the standard that the people are urging be adopted now for expenditure lobbyists. There was no discussion, by the way, when that language was presented. There was just a vote immediately at the committee and then at the board. So it never had a robust discussion, the kind we're all capable of doing.
Thanks.
Good morning. Welcome, new Executive Director. My name is Bruce Wolf. I'm a former Sunshine Ordinance Task Force member, and I work for a notable nonprofit and serve on 2 boards of local nonprofits. So this is a very interesting thing because Prop C, for the most part, excluding the nonprofit aspect of it, is great. As an open government advocate, completely into a level of political transparency, I think Prop C in those respects are good. I think the area around the nonprofits, as I'm hearing from both my fellow nonprofit colleagues and some of your comments yourselves, and from what was noted in the interested persons document, express a lot of the problems that will have to, and hurdles will have to come through. I just want to say that certain items in here are very clear. Exposing nonprofits to gotcha complaints. That is really important. It would invite possible undue scrutiny by the IRS. And to have that happen would be devastating. It's one thing if you're a regular taxpayer and you do something that might cause yourself an audit. It's between you and one other agency. But when you are now have other sets of laws that are based upon a tertiary agency or a very specific agency that then extends to other agencies, you have a daisy chain effect then, that could cause a huge problem, especially for the kinds of nonprofits we're talking about, most of them being smaller nonprofits with very limited operating budgets, very limited rainy day funds or reserves to be able to handle excessive, not actually, let's not even go to fines. Let's just say hiring attorneys, hiring consultants that need to help them understand about the violation. It could mean accountants of some sort. It could mean a whole slew of other people, contractors or what have you, that they normally would never have to hire. And to even try to plan for that could be very, very difficult, considering the way they get money. They're not selling anything. They have to go out and virtually beg for money. I think another point, because I don't have a lot of time here, was with regards to the broad definition that would exempt activity that Prop C was intended to capture. I think some of the comments that Commissioner Keene and others had made around the budget, around that there was this very excessive political activity, points to that. And I don't think that these nonprofits are in that boat. So I think a real distinction and bright line is very important. Thank you.
Thank you.
I'm Bob Planthold. I urge you to not too quickly narrow the scope of any definitions or applicability of rules or too narrowly write regulations. And we're going to base this on history. And again, this is archival. Before any of you were on the commission, before anybody in the staff, before your assigned legal counsel. We heard earlier from Oliver Luby, this is somewhat of a restoration of the way things were prior to a ballot measure in 2009. So I want to suggest, look at what the situation was like in 2008 and preceding in terms of applicability to the types of agencies and groups that are now saying, whoa, there's a big problem. Because in the early part of the first decade, there was a firefighters union that put a ballot measure and won, and they complied with all those regulations. Not necessarily is the projection of a problem indicative that there really was a problem then, and therefore, if it wasn't a problem then, why should it be a problem now? So, and because I'm suggesting archival research to do a comparison, that's another basis for why you need more staff to do that. I want to go further. You're hearing concerns about possible phantom or just blatant complaints made to stymie somebody. So here again, go look at the list of those complained against in 2002, 3, and 4, because as commissioners, we got to see against whom a complaint was made, even if there was yet no discussion or settlement. First off, the person complaining against doesn't get told unless there is presumed grounds for a problem. So just because there's a complaint doesn't mean it goes anywhere. But secondly, look at the list of those names. Some of those people then complaining out are still active politically. Some of those people are actually professionally, personally associated with some of the groups here saying there's a problem. So there's a dichotomy between the reality of the complaints and what people are saying is going to happen. I'll go further. There was a major revision of the Sunshine Ordinance that required nonprofits getting city funds to have at least 2 open public meetings a year. I was on the board of 2 nonprofits. They were scared all sorts of people were going to come out of the woodwork. Well, that amendment passed, and it hasn't happened. What the people were projecting as problems for their nonprofits did not occur. So you need to look at the reality, not just what people are afraid of now.
Thank you.
Good morning, Commissioners. Peter Cohen with the Council of Community Housing Organizations. We've been working with Human Services Network since the beginning. We, like they, have several member organizations and are concerned about the unintended consequences of the measure. As you know, we were opposed to Prop C. We considered it to have been a principled opposition, not to its intent, but its unintended consequences. But we do thank the Commission for setting up a couple workshops. I think we came here in December, or it was late November, and said we really need to discuss what wasn't discussed at the time. And that led to a very interesting and comprehensive discussion on December 7th. I think the staff memo was quite thorough, and thank you, Commissioner Rennie, for being there. There were a whole wide range of issues fleshed out, most of which you've heard today. And to Commissioner Herr's point, getting the bright lines around those issues is very, very critical, and there are many of them, and we have a short period of time to do it. Of course, I will join Debbie Lerman in saying the easiest way to do it is just to have a legislative amendment to get nonprofits out from the crosshairs if that wasn't your intent. It's pretty clear that's not where the Commission wants to go right now, so we will focus with you on the regulatory language, but there's a lot to cover. I know Bob Planthold, and I understand you have a long history. The reality is for a lot of us younger generation who don't have the archival history, is we weren't involved in this drafting at all. And the consultation that we could have, should have had was there on the 7th, and I hope that spirit continues over the remainder of the month into next Wednesday's interested persons meeting. And what we'd like to do is come in with some very specific proposals for what that regulatory language should be, covering the issues we heard today. I want to add just a couple of other things beyond what was mentioned. There is the question of how to define members. Nonprofits come in all different shapes, sizes, different colors of fruit, so to speak, and what a member is for one nonprofit is not the same as for another. So I think it's going to take a lot to think through how to define what members are, either broadly or, if some folks say narrowly, to make sure that everyday activity, sending out newsletters and communications and doing things on behalf of members, doesn't leave some organizations at more risk than others. That also relates to staff time and things like communications. Nonprofits carry staff. That's what we do. We don't outsource a lot of our work. And so how do we count staff times towards communications or research or reports? That's another question we need to determine. And then lastly, newsletters. You know, we try to communicate our message out to our members, but it goes out broadly. So how do some of our regular communications through newsletters and other things get counted or not as expenditures towards lobbying activities when we're trying to keep our members informed? I think a combination of carefully crafted regulations, potentially with some legislative amendments, we'd still like you to consider that, will end up helping Prop C focus on its target and not have the unintended consequences that I think, Chair Rennie, you were very clear, none of you wanted to see happen. And we want to work with you to make sure that happens. Thank you.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Sir, what is the average budget size of your member organizations?
We have member organizations that have budgets as small as, let's say, $300,000, $400,000, $500,000 to organizations that have multi-million-dollar budgets. It depends on the degree to which they have large client services and have city contracts, or whether they're very small constituent-based organizations. It's really all over the map.
If you could just estimate a median, I mean, are most of them over $1 million? Just roughly, I'm trying to get a sense.
Probably the average is over $1 million, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
And you said that you intend at next week's interested persons meeting to present to the staff specific language on the various issues that you think should be clarified.
At least to the extent that, I mean, may not be legally drafted language. I'm not a lawyer, most of us are not. But that. Language that's more than just conceptual, but actually gets to specific topics. I think we'd much rather, I'm speaking for myself here, not be reacting once again to what staff comes up as language, but actually presenting some ideas and workshopping that through with staff and the Commission to come up with something that feels right for all of us. So we want to be proactive. It was a little hard today. You heard some specific suggestions from Local 2 and Alliance for Justice and others, which is great. But we'd really like to have this next week to come forward with, you know, a set of at least initial proposals around what the regulatory language should be, and then start to really refine it with staff, and hopefully by the time of your 25th be pretty close to the finish line.
Thank you, because that is what the message that I said at the interested persons meeting before, is that to the extent that a nonprofit thinks there's a definition, it would be very helpful if they gave what language they were proposing so that the staff can consider it in drafting whatever regulations they come up with. And also urging that at least by the end of January, I don't think we're going to be in a position to talk about drafting amendments which are inconsistent with the ordinance, which would require us to get 4 commissioners to approve and the Board of Supervisors to approve. But your drafting should be toward regulations to implement it and consistent with the spirit. Okay?
Chair Rennie, I agree, and that's what I said. I think we're focused on the regulatory language. I will say that, the idea of a nonprofit exemption, whether it could be tailored in a way that actually specifically looks at small nonprofits serving certain communities, we'd like to at least continue that conversation so that it doesn't just end. The other issue is the threshold. To Ian Lewis's point, part of it is it aggregate or is it single expenditure, single purpose? That makes a big difference. And $2,500 really is a relatively low threshold. Mm-hmm. And I'm concerned for some of our smaller organizations. You heard earlier, just going through simple reporting processes can create a real nightmare for folks. So the question perhaps for an amendment is maybe the threshold could be a little bit higher. Anyway, thank you.
Any other public comment?
Good morning, Commissioners. Mark Solomon, a 26-year resident of the Mission. What we got here is a bunch of folks who snoozed and lost, who made a play at the ballot and lost. And now they're coming for a third bite at the apple, and I hope they lose again. What happened 30 years ago in ancient prehistory is that government function was outsourced to private nonprofits during the Reagan years. As that has evolved over the past 20 or some odd years, you've seen a complete shift in agency. So you've got folks who are both providing services to people that the government used to provide, and they're advocating. And the ethical conflict is when you advocate for different services and you get money to provide those services and advocate in the policy area. Because when you're advocating for services and you happen to manufacture a widget, you're going to say, hey, you want to take care of the poor folks? We make this poor folk service widget. Buy it from us. And that's where the ethical conflict is, in representation and advocacy. And you don't get to represent people unless you actually get their commitment and buy-in for representation. So what you have are a bunch of folks from private nonprofit agencies who purport to speak for people but never get their buy-in. I live in the Mission District. A lot of folks behind me speak for what my neighbors want, but they never ask us what we want. And at the rate they're going in providing services, the folks they claim to care about are going to be long gone. So it is important that this commission make sure that folks, especially getting city money to advocate, do that under the glare of sunshine. Because I want to know who's doing grassroots organizing in the Mission District to further their own economic interests with these nonprofits while my neighborhood is being clear-cut through displacement because they're not doing their jobs. It's happening every day, and it is horrifying to live in this and see the commuter nonprofit corps come in, expect special rights to conduct political advocacy without buy-in, and then expect to be covered for it and get more money. So this is a major problem. I think that the Tenants Union is not a nonprofit last time I checked. They probably don't fall under this. I think we need to have some kind of a scale based on the budget of the nonprofit. But for city-funded agencies that lobby city government and engage in AstroTurf activities, they cannot hide under the penumbra of the Koch brothers nonprofit foot under the door. We have to be sure that when we have advocacy happening, that everyone knows who's doing it, everyone knows what they're doing, and if it's going to be an interdepartmental transfer from one city agency to another, that's got to be something that this city government includes in its planning for when we go ahead and outsource government functions to private agencies. And we cannot allow this one to escape through. We've had many bites at the apple, and as a progressive, as someone who wants to see government represent the people and not the businesses, folks have left the progressive movement and not worked on campaigns because of this cap of the nonprofits that decide they want to represent folks without their consent, and it's a major problem for the city. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have a suggestion for you. When you go to sleep at night, lay your head down on the pillow and remember 3 words: further the purposes of the act. So the overarching principle is that we're supposed to be moving ahead. And in this case, it's a good example of how we rescinded or repealed the previous law. And we're now paying the price, in a sense, of trying to get it back into force. And I'm thinking that we didn't necessarily further the purposes of the act when we repealed the law previously, and the environment changed, and we had a lot of, what is it called? Oh gosh, that word, those magic words, the sharing economy. That came in and fell right into this provision of the law, which we had just repealed. So I think it's not the intent for us to go after our little nonprofits in the city. It's more a matter of dealing with the larger international players that are coming in with a lot of money, and I understand GM just put in a lot of money into Lyft, I believe it was, $500 million. So that's what we're up against because we've become an international city. So think in terms of furthering the purposes of the act because we're no longer the little city that we once were. Basically, somebody once said to me, we're not a city, we're a resort. The resort is come to really true fruition now with an international resort. And we have to basically further our purposes of these acts to step up to this plate of our international, our role as an international city. Thanks.
Commissioner Herr.
I have a question. Question for the city attorney. If we were to attempt to exempt or define nonprofits in a way that exempted those who who were below a certain budget number, would that be something that could be done via regulation, or would that have to be an amendment?
I think that would require an amendment to the ordinance.
Because we've already identified 501c3s as, I guess we refer to 501c3s. We don't define them, but we do refer to them as 501c3 under the U.S. Code. So you think that we couldn't further define what we mean by 501c3?
Well, the current reference to 501c3s and 501c4s in the ordinance is only with respect to the registration fees.
Right.
And sort of at a higher level, more generally, obviously regulations are intended to clarify the scope of an ordinance, not to actually change actually what is supposed to be regulated versus what's not supposed to be regulated.
Right.
And I would simply note in pretty sure it was the last meeting just before we submitted Prop C to the ballot, we actually had a very explicit discussion at one of these meetings about whether or not to exempt nonprofits, and the commission decided not to do so.
Right.
So it's hard to say that there's a issue that needs to be clarified. I think it was pretty clear at that point what the intent was.
Well, we said we didn't want to exempt all nonprofits. We heard some good arguments about why that would be a problem. We didn't really address the issue of nonprofits above or below a certain threshold.
Yeah, and I certainly don't have a transcript in front of me, but I do recall that the commission did consider that issue, as you say, maybe not at quite this level of detail, but it did seem pretty clear to me from the discussion, as far as I recall, that the commission was not inclined to provide an exception.
And the legal repercussion of seeking to do this by regulation rather than amendment is that some larger nonprofit could sue saying you haven't complied with with your amendment process and you did via regulation what could only be done by amendment. Is that sort of the...
Yeah, I guess that's interesting to think about. So if an agency overstepped what it could adopt a regulation about, yeah, I suppose it could be an interested party sort of on either side of that issue who could seek to file, I suppose, a writ of mandate in Superior Court seeking the commission to overturn or reject its regulation. But I'm not even sure if it would need to be an interested party. I mean, if we're talking about the duties of a public body like the Ethics Commission, I think probably any person in San Francisco...
Anybody with standing?
I think they would have standing to file a writ of mandate saying that we violated one of our official duties by pursuing an issue via regulation where we really should have done so through ordinance.
Okay.
But that's obviously a hypothetical. I don't know how likely that actually is.
Sure. Appreciate that.
Sure. Commissioner Andrews.
So I just want to, again, go on record to say that, yes, we did have, I I do remember this distinct conversation that we had about nonprofits. I had dissent on it. I ultimately voted on the intention of it, but I had challenges around how it would play itself out. And we often talked about, at that particular time, we were throwing B&B out as often as we could as an example, and I understand that. At the same time, B&B is, with all due respect to all of the lawyers in the room, are all lawyered up and ready to combat anything that we may come at them with. So when I mentioned earlier that we could very well be participating in the universal law of order and chaos and creating order and coming after them, they're well prepared for us compared to the chaos of the smaller nonprofits who I understand there's a difference between, or it seems to me that we're struggling with the word between advocacy and lobbying, and for those who understand lobbying a particular way, define it that way, and want to more capture advocacy around that or public policy. And for those who are smaller nonprofits that do public policy that represent low-income individuals or vulnerable San Franciscans, how they would very much not see that as lobbying and advocating for those who don't have a voice and hear from them often and are in many ways the bridge to resources. So there are a couple dynamics that are at play here, but I ultimately have to say that I know that when we talked about, and I wasn't around for this, but I know that there was an exemption for contact lobbying, and it seems to me the fundamental premise that is behind contact lobbying that provided an exemption for nonprofits is that it was a part of the normal course of business, that it was so much of a part of the normal course of business that there was an exemption that was needed. So I just want to make sure that we revisit at least some of the rationale that went behind that ultimately then could be applied to those nonprofits that where it is their normal course of business, that do represent marginalized populations. And I don't know that size gets you there, because in many ways we hear size matters. I wonder if it's the type of service that is being provided or the advocacy that is being provided or public policy. And it seems to me that you're not going to be able to get there because there's so many nonprofits that do so many different and wonderful things that are health and human services, public policy, advocacy, education, that have member organizations, that have direct service that is being provided, that no amount of, I have a feeling, regulation or amendment is going to get there enough to certainly satisfy everybody here in the room. I'm saying all of these as observations as I've heard about 5 or 6 or 7 different angles coming at this particular issue. I'm glad we're going to try to address it during regulation. Organizational size may matter, but I also would say that the type of the service that is being provided also matters. How that gets written up and embedded into a regulation, I'm not necessarily sure. But it was very clear today that while I wasn't being completely descriptive and articulate on some of the challenges that I said months back when I said this could be scorched earth for a lot of smaller nonprofits while you're busy getting the B&Bs. Those real-life situations that we just heard are those situations that I struggle with. And when Ms. Lerman references and the Human Services Network references the chilling effect, the chilling effect ultimately is any nonprofit's business decision they'll come together and gather on a Tuesday and have a meeting and say, are we going to just do the work that we have committed ourselves to doing, or is this getting in the way of the work that we need to advance, which is public policy work, education work, getting the word out to a community that may or may not receive this good information and knowledge that is out there, and resources for them, if not but for that organization doing the work that they do. So I just again want to go on record with that. I know that there are many different dynamics that are at play here, but I'm glad we're able to begin to address it today and moving forward on the 13th as well.
Mr. Keene?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think one of the things that should be pointed out here, and I'll start off by acknowledging and agreeing with Commissioner Andrews that we could pick out a group of activities and say these are folks who are doing God's work, and therefore we don't want to regulate them or we don't want to make things difficult for them. Therefore we'll exempt them or we'll make it less onerous. But putting on one of the things, I'm a professor of constitutional law, and I teach constitutional law, and there is a clear First Amendment prohibition against any kind of regulation which is content-based. That is, that you're allowing advocacy on the basis of one type of content or helping advocacy on the basis of one type of content, but you're not allowing it on the basis of some other type of content. And the United States Supreme Court, in several cases going back decades, spoke to that. A couple of them had to do with picketing, where you had ordinances in various communities that said there can be no picketing in residential neighborhoods. And that's because you don't want to disturb the peace and quiet of people in residential neighborhoods. And in the cases that existed, the unions used their particular political power to say, hey, wait a minute, we may have a beef in regard to some scab laborers who are putting up a house in that neighborhood, and we want to picket to show that it's non-union labor. So unions should be exempt, and the particular communities wrote in the exemptions. Supreme Court of the United States struck down the whole law in regard to having any kind of prohibition against picketing in residential neighborhoods. So the danger, Commissioner Andrews, is that in regard to us picking out particular types of organizations and saying, well, they're doing God's work, they're really doing stuff that is helpful to vulnerable people, and we won't want that. They're not the Koch brothers, they're not these pirates, and not these miserable characters that we all want to see really regulated. So we'll pick them out and we'll say, you guys don't have to worry about it. We do that, and the whole law gets, our entire regulation gets thrown out, because it's seen then as content-based in violation of the First Amendment. We can't do that. And I think it's unfortunate we can't, because I agree with you. We could see there are lots of things that we really should protect this, but we can't.
And that wouldn't apply on that same rationale would not apply on a size of an organization? Why the under 10 million as opposed to the over the 10 million?
I don't know whether it would apply on the size of an organization, but I can tell you that if in regard to picking a group out and saying this group advocates for these kind of activities, like the activities of crippled children, or the activities of blind people, and we really want to make sure that this vulnerable group of people get protected. So these organizations, we're going to exempt them. We can't do that. That is clearly content-based. The Supreme Court of the United States has spoken to that. It's a violation of the First Amendment. On your question relating to size, I haven't thought that through, so I don't have an answer for you on that.
Then my last piece on that with this is, if that indeed is the case and content rules, and you can define content however we're defining content, we're going to find out what content truly, how broadly based that's defined. It seems to me that we would pay at least a decent amount of attention on getting a decision on raising the level of the expenditure, in which case we control that, all apply. It would be whether an organization is $100,000 and decided to spend $20,000, or an organization is $10 million and decided to spend $20,000. They both are under the same regulation. So it seems to me that if we're going to move forward with some of these, we would get some brighter line here, that this phrase a lot, bright lines and definition around it. But if there was a way in which we could address that, and I know that we're short on time, so it's hard to do any kind of analysis on how much any of these organizations spend on an annual basis on advocacy and public policy, but at least to figure out how to raise these levels where it doesn't have undue harm to a lot of well-meaning smaller nonprofits who probably will have some expenditures throughout the year because it's a part of their budget. It's a part of the nature of their work. It's through the course of their day, through the course of the year, the nature of their work. I don't know what that number is.
Commissioner Herr.
So I think it's pretty clear that raising the $2,500 number would have to be by amendment. I mean, that one is pretty clear, and I don't disagree with that, but I agree with Commissioner Rennie that now we need to focus on regulation, and that I think means all of you helping us. We appreciate the help that you're providing, but also working together. If the nonprofits come up with something that's bright line, but really is antithetical to what we're doing here, that's not going to be helpful. So if you guys can work together, work with our staff, given our limited time, we would very much appreciate that, and we do appreciate all your input today. Mr. Shen, I would also appreciate if the city attorney would look a little bit more into whether you could add a threshold number by regulation rather than amendment. I don't think it's as clear as I don't think it's a clear no. Maybe ultimately we decide it's not something we can do by regulation, but if you could maybe do a little more research and thinking about it, and if you come back with the same answer, then I understand. But I would like a little more thought into whether by regulation we could define nonprofits or define the entities as those who have a budget above a certain amount, something like that. Thank you.
I would ask Ms. Pelham if she has any thoughts or comments on this. You had a similar type of regulation in Los Angeles, and in assisting in the staff in drafting proposed regulations, or at least interim regulations, given the short time period. If you have any thoughts about where we might go.
I don't have any proposed or any suggestions today. I think it'll be very helpful to meet here for next week's interested persons meeting more about the issues. And there may be some additional work that we can look to the Los Angeles experience to see if there's any data that might be helpful to Commissioner Andrews' point. But I think the conversation today is very helpful in framing the issues up a bit further. But I don't have any suggestions for you at this point. I think I'll stand until next week's interested persons meeting and a bit more discussion.
I mean, one of the, I forget which of the group that came up at the December Interested Persons meeting, I think was a disability rights advocate or something, which the spokesperson said that she was the only employee of the organization, but obviously their entire effort is, if there's legislation dealing with those issues, to galvanize interested people, and she was questioning whether or not that would constitute expenditure lobbying to do it, and I said at that time that my reaction was that wouldn't be, because they were out in the public. That was their whole mission, was galvanizing people to go to their elected representatives on an issue, and that there's no question of transparency or concern about the fact that the public isn't aware that this group is doing this. And so I may have had, maybe I have a more restricted view of what constitutes expenditure lobbyists, as opposed to a group whose only mission is to further the rights of people with disability. That certainly wasn't what I was aiming at in advocating for Prop C.
Although there is a reading of Prop C that would.
Absolutely, but it is I would not be disturbed if we had regulations that would exempt the group that was clearly out in the public. That's all their purpose was, to advocate on a given issue, because what we are really concerned about is transparency. But there is no question of transparency at that point. And I don't know if you can deal with that by regulation, but that clearly is where I was coming from in what we were after in Prop C.
Mr. Chair, would Mr. Bush define that same organization that you just referenced as a lobbyist? because I heard you use almost interchangeably lobbying and advocacy, and you seeing little daylight between the two of them.
The way I've heard it discussed, I have not seen much daylight between the two. But if you're talking about an organization that's asking members of the public to contact city officials on an administrative or legislative matter, and who are spending $2,500 or so to do that, then as the law is currently written, it would be covered as something that had to be disclosed. I guess in a practical term, having worked in small organizations, other than the federal government, of course, that it was hard to come up with how you can spend $2,500 in a world that operates on the internet. You know, you can develop an entire web page and keep updating it for about $1.99. And if you have a mailing list, you're not spending $2,500 to reach out to those people. So it comes down to the fact that you really need to know what the facts are in the case. We've heard from some of the unions some very good examples of facts. If you're reaching out to organize members who are not yet members of your union, are you doing a member communication? Because you're recruiting them, hopefully, to join your union. Well, in my view, that is a member communication, because they may not yet be paying dues, but your intent is to get them to join your organization. If you are doing a membership drive, and under the rubric of a membership drive, urging people to contact the Board of Supervisors on an issue. Say you're with the American Legislative Exchange Council and you're opposing sanctuary, and so you urge people to give money to the American Legislative Exchange Council and also contact the board. That's lobbying, that, in my view. I hope I've just really not clarified anything.
No, you did. You're consistent, if anything.
All right. If do any of the commissioners have any further comments or instructions to the staff to assist in drafting proposed regulations? And I emphasize that whatever regulations we adopt at the meeting on January 28th will be deemed to be interim, and with the intention that the Commission and its staff will continue to look at the problems with the idea in mind that as we go forward, we may find that we need further tweaking of it. And if, in fact, we believe that there is a need for an amendment which requires the approval of 4 commissioners and the approval of a supermajority at the Board of Supervisors, we will be open to that. So this is going to be developing over a period of time. I would urge the staff to try and, insofar as the forms that are needed to be filed, to simplify them as to much as possible so that they're not putting a heavy burden on any organization as to what it has to do. And I would also urge the groups that if they have any questions, once these regulations come out and we're going forward in 2016, if they have questions about whether or not they fall within the language of the expenditure lobbyists, that they contact the staff and get guidance from the executive director in saying, no, you aren't in it, and therefore they've got the protection if anybody tries to do a gotcha, or the being told that yes, they are, and they've got a file and have to go forward. All right, with that, I will entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Any public discussion? Not?
You debate everything.
Call a vote. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you all.